The storm had passed, but the scent of rain still lingered in the air outside the auditorium of Pine Hill High School. It was a spring evening wrapped in the kind of nostalgic warmth that only small towns could conjure, humid, soft, and laced with the smell of old brick, fresh grass, and years gone by. Inside, the gymnasium had been transformed for a modest alumni event, folding chairs in neat rows, a projector screen blinking blue, and table with coffee that had been brewed far too early in the day. No one expected Elon Musk to actually show up. The idea of one of the world's most enigmatic public figures returning to a forgotten public school in Ohio felt like a headline from a satirical blog. Yet there he was, no entourage, no cameras, just a man in a black jacket that looked like it had survived more than its share of sleepless flights and red-eye regrets. Elon didn't say much when he arrived, nodding politely to the few former teachers who still recognized him from a brief semester spent here in 1999. It was a time in his life rarely discussed, barely footnoted. One teacher, however, hadn't forgotten. Her name was Marjorie Callahan, though everyone had always called her Ms. Callie. She was nearing retirement now, her once auburn hair now a halo of silver, her stride slower but still deliberate. In her hands, she clutched something wrapped in tissue paper and string. She had carried it with her for 25 years. "You probably don't remember me," she said with a tired smile as she approached Elon. "But I remember you, and I've kept this for you." He looked at her, those glacier eyes of his suddenly uncertain. "Ms. Callahan," he murmured, "you taught creative writing." "Yes," she nodded. "And you wrote something for me once. An assignment, but you didn't finish it. You said you'd complete it someday, and then you left." She handed him the bundle. Elon hesitated for a moment. Then he took it, his fingers brushing against the fragile paper, his expression unreadable. Around them, the gym buzzed faintly with the chatter of forgotten classmates and lukewarm memories, but the moment between them was entirely silent, suspended like the calm before a tide. Back in his hotel room that night, Elon didn't turn on the lights. The skyline blinked outside the wide windows, half fogged by condensation, half lit by the dim pulse of a town that never truly slept, just slowed down. He unwrapped the bundle slowly, methodically, as if it were something sacred. Inside was a folded piece of lined paper, yellowed with age, and a note from Ms. Callahan, written in ink that had bled slightly through the years. "You told me this wasn't finished. Maybe now it is. Or maybe now you'll finally understand why it mattered so much." Elon unfolded the letter, and what he read made his hands tremble ever so slightly. It wasn't what he had written, it was what he had forgotten. The letter was titled, "The World I Want to Build." It began with childish ambition, sketches of cities in the sky and cars without roads, but midway through, it shifted. There was a paragraph, scrawled hastily and barely legible, that spoke not of machines, but of people. It spoke of a boy who watched his mother cry behind closed doors, who listened to silence where laughter should have been, who once handed a peanut butter sandwich to a homeless man and felt, for the first time, that maybe he could do something that mattered. And then it stopped, mid-sentence. "If I could just," and nothing after. Elon stared at the incomplete thought. 25 years later, it felt like a mirror he wasn't ready to face. He remembered the feeling now, the burning need to imagine a world better than the one he had, not out of optimism, but out of desperation. He hadn't written to dream, he had written to survive. And somehow Ms. Callahan had known. He folded the letter again, this time with reverence. Not because of what it said, but because of what it awakened. The next morning, he returned to the school, asking to speak to her again. Ms. Callahan was in the library, sipping tea and humming to herself. She looked up unsurprised. "You read it." "I did," he said, and then he paused. "But I don't think I finished it. Not even now." She smiled softly. "Some stories need time." The door to the Pine Hill High School library creaked open with the sound of 1,000 past footsteps, scuffed shoes, whispered secrets, and quiet afternoons when knowledge had meant more than grades. The smell hit Elon first, old paper, dry ink, a hint of lemon cleaner barely masking the aging scent of dusty bindings and time-worn pages. Ms. Callahan sat at a square oak table beneath the tall windows, the light pouring over her, as if time had forgotten to chase her down completely. She looked like she belonged there, still rooted in a world of stories and soft-spoken revolutions, where a well-timed question could change the trajectory of a life. Elon stood at the threshold for a moment longer than necessary. Something about the room made him feel younger, smaller, unfinished. Ms. Callahan looked up slowly, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She gave a soft nod, wordlessly inviting him in. He crossed the room, like a man approaching something sacred. She didn't rise, just gestured toward the empty chair across from her. The seat was familiar, scuffed at the edges, the left leg shorter than the others. He remembered now. That was the chair he had always picked during their short-lived creative writing sessions. It had rocked unevenly, just like his confidence back then. "I didn't remember the letter until I saw it," he said quietly, easing into the seat. "But when I read it, I remembered everything." "That's the thing about writing," she replied, stirring her tea. "It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It waits for you to return." He looked down at his hands, suddenly aware of how they trembled just slightly, barely noticeable unless you were paying attention. She was. Ms. Callahan had always paid attention. To the awkward silences, to the distracted gazes, to the kids who weren't failing academically but were slipping quietly through the cracks of everything else. "You were one of the quiet ones," she said, "but not because you didn't have anything to say." He nodded. "I was scared I'd say the wrong thing." "You didn't," she said gently. "You wrote what you needed to, even if you never finished it." A long silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, just full. He pulled the letter from his coat pocket, still folded neatly, still warm from where he'd held it most of the night. He placed it on the table, and for a moment, it sat there like an artifact, fragile, powerful, waiting. "Do you know why I kept it?" she asked. He shook his head. "Because it wasn't about your words," she continued. "It was about your need to say them. That need. It told me you were trying to build something. Not just a better world out there," she said, motioning vaguely toward the horizon, "but something inside. A bridge between who you were and who you wanted to become." Elon felt something stir inside him, a kind of ache. A longing not for the past, but for the clarity that the past could sometimes offer, if you were brave enough to revisit it. "I forgot who that boy was," he murmured, "but I think I'm starting to remember." Ms. Callahan smiled again, but wasn't the smile of a teacher proud of an old student. It was the smile of someone who had known all along that some seeds take years to bloom. She reached beneath the table and brought out a manila folder, thick with papers and dusted along the edges. "This," she said, sliding it across to him, "is the writing portfolio I collected from my students that year. I kept yours, and a few others. I thought maybe, just maybe, some of you would come back one day." Elon opened it with the reverence of someone opening a time capsule buried beneath layers of identity. Inside were essays, stories, and poems, written in half-legible teenage scrawl, marked with red ink encouragements and soft corrections. He recognized the name Tanya Deedat, a girl who had always sat by the window and drawn stars in the margins of her notebooks. And Mark Jade, a quiet boy who never smiled but wrote the most haunting, lyrical pieces about space and silence. "I kept them all," she said, "because every once in a while, someone writes something that doesn't belong to the moment it was written in. It belongs to the person they might become." Elon ran his hand across the pages, his mind brimming with memories he hadn't summoned in decades. "Have any of them come back?" "Only you," she said, "so far." They spent the rest of the morning reading, not talking much, just letting the words speak across the chasm of time. At one point, Elon found a short poem he had written, one he had no memory of writing. It was about a door that could only be opened with a song you'd forgotten how to sing. He didn't know what it had meant then, but now the meaning was blindingly clear. Before leaving, he turned back to Ms. Callahan at the door of the library. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing me, for saving this." She tilted her head slightly. Sometimes all a teacher can do is hold on to the pieces. It's up to the student to come back for them. And hey, before we keep going, just a quick moment to pause. If you're feeling something right now, maybe it's time you subscribe. But not because everyone tells you to. Do it because stories like these matter to you. Because you know that sometimes the smallest gesture, a saved letter, a forgotten poem, a teacher who remembers, can ripple for decades. All right, let's get back to our story. Elon stood outside the school once more, the morning sun rising higher, throwing long shadows from the flagpole that still stood proud in the courtyard, its base now rusted with time. The day had opened like a wound he hadn't realized was still there, an old emotional fracture that had never fully healed. The letter, the poem, the conversation with Ms. Callahan. It was as if someone had dug into the walls of his memory and pulled out a foundation stone he'd forgotten existed. And now, everything around it was starting to shift. The man who had built rockets, engineered electric futures, and pitched humanity toward Mars now stood quietly on the steps of a public high school, holding a folder filled with poems written by children. And somehow, it felt heavier than launching a Falcon 9. He wasn't sure why he didn't leave right then. Maybe it was inertia. Or maybe it was that sense, that tug in his chest, that told him something was still unresolved. Something about this place, this day, this version of himself he'd been forced to remember. He wandered back inside through the side door near the gymnasium. The air inside was different now, less formal. It felt like wandering through a museum of someone else's life, his own, perhaps, but fragmented and foreign. The hallway was lined with bulletin boards that hadn't changed much over the decades. There were new faces, of course, and updated slogans. Be the change, you belong here, kindness is contagious. But the bones of it all, the chipped tiles, the buzzing fluorescent lights, the echo of distant voices, remained stubbornly the same. He found himself walking past room 214. The door was open. Inside, a class was empty, and sunlight danced lazily across the tops of desks worn smooth by generations of restless fingers. On the far wall hung a collection of framed black and white photographs, one for each graduating class over the last 50 years. He didn't mean to go inside, but something pulled him. He stepped across the threshold and walked toward the wall of faces, scanning year after year, until his eyes locked on one photo from 1999. The glass was cracked in the corner, the image slightly yellowed. And there, second row from the top, fourth from the right, was a face he hadn't seen in over 2 decades, his own. A wiry boy with tired eyes and a crooked smile. Even then, he looked like he was thinking about other planets. He stared at the photo longer than he intended, and then something strange happened. He laughed, quietly but genuinely. Not at the picture itself, but at the memory it summoned. It was a day he hadn't thought about in years. The day that photo was taken, he had arrived late to school, soaked from walking in the rain after missing the bus. Ms. Callahan had found him in the hallway, dripping water on the linoleum, and instead of scolding him, she had handed him a dry sweater from the lost and found. It had been 2 sizes too big and had smelled faintly of peppermint, but it was warm. And more than that, it was kind. That sweater had made him feel seen, respected, human. Back in the present, Elon reached into the folder again and retrieved the letter. He unfolded it, studying the way the pencil lines curved and bent, how the ink had faded in places. The unfinished sentence haunted him. If I could just... What had he wanted to say? What had that boy, soaked from rain and borrowed sweaters, been on the verge of declaring to the world? He searched his memory for the next line, but it never came. Only the feeling, that raw, confused ache of wanting to fix something he didn't understand. He thought of his mother, May, and the sound of her crying in the kitchen late at night when she thought he and his siblings were asleep. He remembered holding his younger brother's hand as they walked past shuttered stores downtown, pretending it was all a game. He remembered wishing someone, anyone, would give him a sign that he wasn't just invisible static in a world full of noise. That was the boy who wrote the letter. That was the boy Ms. Callahan had seen. Not the future entrepreneur, not the innovator, just a scared, brilliant kid who wanted someone to believe he could matter. And somehow, that letter had survived. And somehow, he had survived too. As he stood in the classroom, a quiet cough startled him. He turned. A janitor in a gray uniform with a mop bucket had entered the doorway and froze when he recognized Elon. "Sorry, sir. Didn't mean to interrupt. Just doing the rounds." No. It's fine," Elon replied, folding the letter and slipping it back into his coat pocket. He nodded toward the class photo. "That's me, right there." The janitor stepped forward, squinting at the photo. He had a kind face, somewhere in his 50s, with thick glasses and the slow gait of someone who'd worked a lot of long days. "No kidding," he said. "You're the reason they painted the STEM lab last year. Got a grant after you donated." Elon chuckled. "I barely remember that." "Well, it made a difference," the janitor said, nodding thoughtfully. "Some of these kids, they really needed that space." There was a pause. Then Elon asked, "Did you work here back then? In '99? The janitor nodded. "Sure did. Long time now. You were quiet, always looking up at the ceiling, like you were trying to see something no one else could." Elon smiled. "Maybe I was." As the janitor moved on, Elon lingered a moment longer. Then he stepped back into the hall, and it struck him. This place hadn't changed much. But maybe that was the point. Maybe places like this weren't meant to change. They were meant to hold the memories we buried, the ones that shaped us without us realizing. And suddenly, he knew what he had to do. Back in the rental car, Elon didn't start the engine. The key sat idle in the ignition while he stared out through the windshield at the world outside, still caught somewhere between who he had been and who he had become. The folder rested on the passenger seat, but felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric, too full of ghosts, too heavy with unsaid things. He didn't know what had made him turn around just now, didn't know why the janitor's words had stayed with him the way they did. You were always looking at the ceiling, like you were trying to see something no one else could. That version of him, the boy with all the questions and none of a language to ask them, was no longer a silhouette in his memory. He was real now, present, and he wanted something. Elon just wasn't sure what. Instead of leaving, he drove around the back of the school, slowly, windows down, letting the warm April air drift in. The building's bricks looked older here, paint chipped along the metal railings, a forgotten bench overtaken by ivy. He pulled up near the teacher's lot and noticed a familiar rusted-out fence. Beyond it was the old faculty bungalow, a compact brick building that once served as a lounge, storage space, and overflow classroom all in one. Something tugged at him. Without quite knowing why, he stepped out of the car, folder in hand, and walked toward it. The door was unlocked. The room inside smelled of mothballs and fading photocopies, with a corkboard still pinned with yellowing announcements from years past. There were boxes stacked in the corners, some labeled with permanent marker, Callahan, ENG, 1995 to 2001. His breath caught. He knelt by the box labeled 1999 and opened it slowly. Inside were stacks of old manila envelopes, grade books, attendance sheets, and more letters. Dozens of them, all handwritten, all sealed. He reached for one at random. It was addressed to Tanya D. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. He opened it and began to read. "Dear Tanya, I know I'm not supposed to play favorites, but if there's ever a moment where you doubt your light, let this remind you. Your stories saved me some days. Not just you, not just your words, but the way you fought for every page you wrote. Someday, someone else will need your courage, too. Pass it on. Ms. C." Elon stared at the letter, stunned. He picked up another. Mark J. And another. Isabel C. And then finally one addressed to Elon M. He hesitated. His name, in her handwriting, dated June 4th, 1999. The day before he left Pine Hill. He opened it, his hands trembling. "Elon, I don't know where your life will take you. Maybe far away. Maybe right back to this small town with its creaky floors and crooked clocks. I just hope you don't forget that before you were anything else, you were a writer. You were a boy who looked at the world and didn't just want to change it, you wanted to understand it. You were brave enough to tell the truth, when you thought no one was listening. And I was listening. Maybe you won't come back here. Maybe this letter will stay sealed forever. But if it doesn't, if you're reading this now, then you've proven something more important than any grade or accolade. That stories matter. And yours isn't finished. With love and belief, Ms. Callie. He folded the letter slowly, reverently, and sat back on his heels. It was almost too much. To think that she had written to all of them, quietly, privately, expecting nothing in return. She had written as if their future selves might one day need a lifeline. And now, 2.5 decades later, he had found his. He packed the box carefully, returned everything just as he'd found it, but took his letter. Not just because it belonged to him, but because it reminded him of a version of himself he had long since edited out of his narrative. The Elon Musk of the headlines, the one painted in extremes, brilliant or brutal depending on the day, had once been this boy. Soft-spoken, creative, scared. Back in the car, he finally started the engine, but didn't drive away. He opened his phone and typed a message, then deleted it, then typed again. Ms. Callahan, thank you for the letter, and for the sweater, and for the silence you filled when no one else could hear what I wasn't saying. I'd like to return the favor. Then he hit send, but it didn't end there. Something inside him had turned, clicked into motion. The folder on the passenger seat wasn't just a folder anymore. It was a door, and he was ready to walk through it. He called an assistant, not his usual one, but a trusted member of the foundation team. I need you to find as many names as you can from Pine Hill's 1999 class. Start with Tanya D., Mark J., Isabel C. There's a few more, and I want to set something up. Quietly, not a press thing, just meaningful. There was a pause on the other end. What kind of something? A gathering, Elon said. A conversation, maybe even a scholarship. But it starts with a story, a real one. I'll explain more later. He ended the call and looked out at the school one last time. The bricks, the windows, the echoes of footsteps from another life. Then he drove off, not away from the past, but toward a version of the future that had been waiting for him to remember who he really was. Elon had spent the last decade building things meant to defy gravity, rockets, companies, ideas, but now he was fixated on something entirely different, grounding himself. It was a peculiar paradox, the way a man could dedicate his life to reaching beyond the atmosphere, yet feel utterly untethered when it came to his own emotional origins. After leaving the school that morning, something inside him refused to settle. He kept returning, in his mind, to the names in the folder, to the faces he hadn't thought about since he was 17. One name in particular stood out like a flare in fog, Tanya Delgado. She had been the type of girl who never needed to raise her voice to command a room. Her presence alone was enough, steady, self-contained, and strangely magnetic. Back then, Elon had found her intimidating in a way he didn't have language for. Not because she was loud or demanding, but because she saw people. Really saw them. And being seen when you're trying so hard to be invisible is its own kind of terror. Her stories had been fearless, especially for teenagers. She wrote about loss and longing with a maturity that unsettled even the teachers. And her writing wasn't polished, but was honest in a way most adults never mastered. He found her after 3 phone calls and 1 persistent assistant. She lived in Cincinnati now, not far, and worked as a social worker in one of the city's public school districts. The assistant had managed to connect them by email, and Tanya, to his mild surprise, responded quickly. Her reply was short and casual, but not cold. Elon, wow, wasn't expecting this. I remember you. Of course. You were the kid who asked questions no one else dared to. I'd be open to a conversation. Just don't expect me to be impressed by Mars. T. It made him smile. She hadn't changed. They met at a small cafe near the school where she worked. It was modest, tucked into the corner of a strip mall with mismatched furniture and a chalkboard menu that still had yesterday's specials faintly visible beneath the new writing. Tanya arrived first. When Elon walked in, she was already seated with a coffee, flipping through a worn leather journal. She looked up and offered a polite, curious smile. "You look taller." "I don't think I am," he replied, sitting across from her. "Maybe just more exposed." She laughed softly. "That sounds about right." She hadn't changed much, still the same intense eyes, the same quiet presence that seemed to fill the space around her without needing to dominate it. Her hair was pulled into a loose braid over one shoulder, and she wore a scarf despite the mild weather. Elon noticed the faint ink stain on her fingers, still writing then. That made him feel better somehow. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me," he admitted. "I remember most people," she said, "but I remember you for a different reason. You were the only one who wrote about your mom." He blinked. "You remember that?" "Of course I do," she said, wrapping both hands around her cup. "Everyone else was writing about fantasy worlds or their dreams of being actors or astronauts. You wrote about making peanut butter sandwiches while your mom cried in the other room. That stuck with me." There was a pause. "I didn't finish that story," he said. "I know," she replied, "but you didn't need to." Another pause, deeper now. "I found a letter," he said, "from Ms. Callahan. Actually, from a box of letters she wrote to all of us." Her eyes widened slightly. "She wrote me a letter?" "Yes," Elon said. "I read it. She said your writing saved her some days." Tanya looked away, blinking a few times, as if she were trying to keep something from spilling over. "I didn't know she saw me like that," she said softly. "She did," Elon replied. "She saw all of us, even when we didn't see ourselves." Tanya nodded slowly. "She was the reason I didn't drop out. Things were rough at home back then. She let me stay after class just so I didn't have to go home right away. I think she knew." "She knew a lot," Elon said, "and she held on to everything, just in case we came back for it." They sat in silence for a while, sipping coffee, watching people come and go through the cafe doors. There was a strange comfort in it. Eventually, Elon reached into his coat and pulled out the folder. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "About putting together some kind of reunion. Not the traditional kind. Something more personal. I want to gather everyone she wrote to. I want us to read our letters. Maybe share our stories. Maybe even create something together. Fund a scholarship or a writing program in her name. Something lasting." Tanya raised an eyebrow. "That's not the Elon Musk I remember." "I'm not sure I remember him either," he said, "but maybe it's time I did." She smiled. "Okay, I'm in, but only if you agree to read your unfinished story out loud. All of it." He groaned. "That's cruel." "No, that's accountability," she said, standing up and tossing her cup into the bin. "You've built rockets. I think you can handle a few metaphors." As they left the cafe together, the sunlight caught the edge of the window, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Elon glanced over at Tanya, this woman who had once written about pain with so much clarity, who had seen him when he didn't know he wanted to be seen, and felt something shift inside him. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't regret. It was something deeper. He was remembering what it meant to be human again. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. 3 days later, Elon stood in front of a corkboard in a modest downtown event space in Columbus, Ohio. The place had once been a church, now repurposed into a community hub. It had exposed brick walls, high arched ceilings, and stained glass windows that filtered the sunlight into fractured colors across the wooden floor. It was the kind of place where stories felt like they belonged. And today, that's exactly what was meant to hold. The idea had taken shape quickly, too quickly if he were honest. But once it planted itself in Elon's mind, it grew with the momentum of everything he'd ever built. The concept was simple but profound, a gathering of the students who had once sat silently in Ms. Callahan's class, each holding stories that had been written long ago but never truly shared. A private reunion. No press. No photographers. Just former students, some now parents, teachers, artists, engineers, sitting together to read aloud the letters they'd forgotten were even written, to acknowledge the voices they once were, and maybe in doing so hear themselves again. Tanya had helped organize it. Her email had become the hub of communication, reaching out to those who still lived in Ohio or nearby, gently nudging those who were harder to track down. And she did it without fanfare, without demanding credit, as if she were simply tending a garden. She never stopped believing it. One by one, names turned into confirmations, then confirmations into stories, then stories into anticipation. Elon had arranged for travel and lodging for those who needed it. He didn't announce his involvement. He didn't want this to be about him. The focus had to stay on Ms. Callahan and the lives she had quietly shaped. He even debated whether he should speak at all. The event began at noon. By 11:30, the space was already full of soft voices, uncertain laughter, and the cautious steps of people who hadn't seen each other in decades. Elon stood by the side entrance, blending in, watching as faces came into focus. Some were instantly recognizable, others bore the subtle erosion of time. He saw Mark Jennings, now a music teacher with silver streaks in his hair and paint smudges on his shoes. Isabel Chun, who had gone into urban planning and carried a tablet in one hand, a reusable coffee cup in the other. Darnell Rivers, who had been quiet to the point of invisibility in high school and now led a nonprofit for youth literacy. Then a hush fell over the room as the final guest arrived, Ms. Callahan. She entered slowly, supported gently by Tanya, wearing a soft blue blouse and the same silver bun that had once made her seem impossibly wise to a room full of teenagers. Her eyes scanned the space, and for a moment, she looked uncertain, almost afraid. But then she saw Elon. Their eyes met, and he nodded. She smiled, wide, full, genuine. Without a word, she walked to the center of the room, and the silence parted around her like a curtain. "I'm not sure I have the right words," she said, her voice raspy but clear, which is funny because I spent a lifetime trying to teach you all how to find yours. Light laughter, gentle, the kind you give someone who earned it. I didn't know if anyone would ever read those letters. I wrote them during my last year of teaching at Pine Hill because I realized I might never get to say the things I really wanted to say. And teachers aren't supposed to play favorites, but we do. Not in the way you think. We don't love one student more than another, but we see something in some of you that we recognize. A spark, a shadow, a story trying to push its way to the surface. And sometimes we see the pain behind your eyes and wish we could take it away. She paused, but we can't, so we write. There were tears in the room now, subtle, private. "I kept your letters," she continued, "because I was afraid if I didn't, your words might disappear. And now, seeing you all here, I realize they didn't. They just needed time." She stepped back, and Tanya came forward. "Today, we're going to hear some of those stories," Tanya said. "The ones you wrote, the ones you didn't finish, the ones that were meant to be forgotten, but somehow weren't." One by one, former students rose and shared. Some read the original letters Ms. Callahan had written to them. Others brought journal entries, poems, fragments of old essays they had saved. Each voice added another layer to the mosaic of memory and meaning. When it was Elon's turn, he didn't bring the letter. He brought the story he never finished. He stood in front of the room, paper in hand, his voice a little unsure at first. "It was called The World I Want to Build," he began. "And I stopped writing it after this sentence. If I could just..." He looked up. "I didn't know how to finish it then. I do now." And then, slowly, with the gravity of someone releasing something sacred, he read the rest, newly written, freshly formed, and full of the wisdom he had gained not from building empires, but from finally listening to the boy he once was. "If I could just remind one person that they matter, then maybe I don't need to build rockets to change the world. Maybe it starts here, with a story, with a letter, with someone who listens when no one else does." The room was silent. Then applause, not thunderous, but warm, human. Ms. Callahan smiled, eyes glistening. And Elon realized, for the first time in a very long time, that he wasn't trying to be understood anymore. He already was. Long after the last chair was stacked, the last goodbye offered, and the afternoon sun had faded into the amber hues of approaching evening, Elon found himself alone again in the now empty community hall. Dust floated in the shafts of golden light, breaking through the stained glass windows, each colored pane scattering warmth across the walls like quiet blessings. The hush of the space felt sacred, like something important had happened, something that didn't need applause or headlines to matter. It had just mattered. Period. He walked slowly to the chair where Ms. Callahan had sat, running his hand along the backrest as though it might still hold the echo of her presence. The letter he'd read aloud, his unfinished story now finished, rested in his jacket pocket, and though he wasn't sure what he'd do with it yet, he knew it would never again be locked away. For so many years, his past had been a shadow, something to escape, outrun, or overcompensate for. Now it felt like a root, something grounding, something to return to again and again. Tanya re-entered through the side door, a tote bag slung over her shoulder, and 2 takeaway coffees in hand. "You didn't leave," she said with a small smile, handing him one of the cups. "I wasn't ready," he replied, accepting it gratefully. They sat in silence for a few moments on the steps of the old altar, now a platform for public speaking. Tanya sipped her drink, her eyes scanning the mosaic of wood and brick and quiet emotion that still clung to the space. "Do you realize what just happened here?" she asked after a while. "I think so," Elon said. "We reassembled something that had been scattered." "No," she said, gently shaking her head. "We gave it voice." He looked at her, and she held his gaze, not in challenge, but in invitation. "So many of us were holding on to these invisible weights," she continued. "And today, for once, we let them speak. Not because we had to, but because it was time." Elon nodded slowly. "I never realized how many versions of myself I left behind, or how many of those versions were still waiting to be acknowledged." Tanya tilted her head. "You think that's what all this was about? You?" The way she said it made him laugh softly. "No," he said, "but maybe part of healing is realizing that we're not the only ones who need to be heard." They talk a while longer, about the others who came, the ones who didn't, and those they couldn't find at all. Some had changed their names, some had moved across oceans, some simply chose silence. But each absence, they agreed, had its own story too. Every blank space on the contact sheet was a life still unfolding, a letter still waiting to be opened. As dusk settled, Tanya pulled out a slim notebook from her tote. "You inspired this," she said, flipping it open and showing him a page near the middle. At the top, in neat, looping handwriting, were the words, "The things we carry." Elon read the rest of the page, then looked up. "It's beautiful." "It's not finished," she said, "but maybe that's okay." There was something sacred about unfinished things now. He no longer felt the pressure to have a final answer. He was beginning to understand that stories weren't always meant to be resolved. Sometimes they were meant to breathe. Before they parted ways, Tanya pulled him into a brief, sincere hug. "Keep going," she whispered, "even if you don't know where it leads." "I will," he replied, and he meant it. That night, back in his hotel room overlooking a sleepy stretch of Ohio skyline, Elon couldn't sleep. He sat at the small desk, the same letters still folded beside his laptop, the air outside cool with the promise of spring rain. He opened a new document and began to type. Not a press release, not an op-ed, just thoughts, reflections, echoes of a day that had reoriented something deep within him. He titled it Callahan. In the document, he started listing the names of the people who had shown up. Beside each, he wrote a single sentence about something they had said or done that had moved him. No judgment, no summary, just fragments of humanity preserved like fireflies in a jar. Then he created a folder on his desktop named Letters Unsent. He wasn't sure what he would do with it yet, but it felt right to begin. Later, he pulled out his phone and opened the photo gallery. There weren't many pictures from the event. He had asked everyone to be present, not to document. But someone had snapped one photo, Ms. Callahan seated in the front row, Tanya beside her, both of them watching him with expressions that said, "We see you." He stared at the photo for a long while. Then, almost without thinking, he posted it on his private account with a single caption. "Sometimes the people who change the world are the ones who teach us how to write it first." He didn't tag anyone, didn't include hashtags. Just sent it into the void, like a digital version of the letters Ms. Callahan once wrote, hoping that someone, somewhere, might stumble upon it when they needed it most. And then he slept. For the first time in a very long time, his dreams were quiet. A week after the gathering, Elon found himself back in California, but something inside him remained anchored in Ohio. The meetings, the stories, the letters, all of it clung to him like the scent of rain after a thunderstorm. You move on, but the air remembers. He tried to return to routine. Meetings, reviews, emails. But something had shifted. For years, his schedule had been built around movement, around propulsion and velocity. Now he found himself slowing down. Not out of fatigue, but out of reverence. Like someone walking through a library for the first time in years, rediscovering the weight of silence and the scent of memory. One morning, he stood in his home office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling whiteboards filled with scribbles and equations, and instead of jumping into calculations or project outlines, he opened his laptop and clicked on the folder titled Letters Unsent. The screen glowed softly in the early light. For several minutes, he didn't type anything, just stared at the folder name. Then slowly, he opened a new document and began to write. Dear Darnell, I never told you this, but back in school, I envied your quiet. You always seemed like you knew something the rest of us didn't. I used to watch you draw in the back of the classroom, spaceships, cities, faces. You saw the world in lines and form. I saw it in fragments and chaos. I think we were both right. He saved the file, then created another. Dear Isabel, the way you stood up to that substitute teacher in junior year, it stayed with me. Not because you were loud, but because you were unshakable. That day you said, we're not here to be controlled. We're here to learn. You were 17. I still remember the silence that followed. I think it changed something in me. One after another, he began writing to the people who had shared that classroom with him. Not just the ones who had made it to the reunion, but even those who hadn't. Some of the letters were short, no more than a few lines. Others poured out like floodwaters, years of unsaid thoughts finally finding a channel. He didn't intend to send them, not yet. Maybe never. But the act of writing them made something inside him feel whole again. Midway through the morning, a message pinged on his phone. It was from Tanya. Hey, Miss Callie isn't doing well. Her granddaughter messaged me. Said she's been in and out of the hospital. Heart issues. Nothing immediately critical, but she asked about you. Elon's hands paused on the keyboard. He stared at the message for a long moment, then replied, What hospital? That same evening, he boarded a private jet bound once again for Ohio. The hospital was just outside of Cincinnati, a small, quiet facility surrounded by pine trees and low stone walls. It didn't have the sleek steel and glass of the places Elon had grown used to. It had warmth, the kind built by time, not design. Tanya met him at the entrance. She looked tired but composed. She's awake, she said softly, and lucid, but they're keeping a close watch. They walked together through the corridors, their steps muted by the soft hospital carpet. The world outside felt distant here, like it belonged to someone else. When they entered the room, Ms. Callahan was propped up slightly in her bed, wearing a pale blue gown that matched the color of her eyes. Her silver hair was looser now, falling gently over her shoulders. The lines on her face had deepened, but her presence was unchanged, still luminous, still grounded in something immovable. She looked up as they entered, and a smile broke across her face. I told them, she said, her voice faint but bright, that the boy who used to write about stars would come back one day. Elon approached her bedside slowly. You remembered that? I remember all my students, she said, even the ones who tried not to be seen. He sat beside her, taking her hand in his. It felt fragile but steady. I've been writing letters, he said. I know, she whispered. I can feel it. Tanya stood quietly at the door, letting them have the moment. You saved all of ours, Elon continued. I wanted you to know we're not going to lose them again. She nodded slowly, her eyes beginning to shimmer. I'm thinking of creating something in your name, he said. A foundation, a fellowship, something that gives kids the space to write what they're afraid to say out loud. Her lips trembled. That's beautiful. No, Elon said, squeezing her hand gently. It's overdue. She closed her eyes briefly, as if to hold the moment like breath. After a while, she spoke again. "You know what I wish?" "What?" "That more people would realize we're all still those kids. Just older." Elon smiled. "I think I'm finally starting to." They sat together for a long time, saying little. But it was enough. Sometimes the presence of someone who once believed in you is more powerful than any words they could offer. As the evening sky turned lavender beyond the hospital windows, Elon stood and leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Thank you," he said, "for waiting." "Thank you," she replied, "for remembering." He stepped out into the hallway, finding Tanya there with tears in her eyes. He didn't ask why. He already knew. "We should record her stories," Tanya said, "before time steals them." "We will," Elon said. "We'll archive every word." The next morning brought with Ella a gentle fog that clung to the Ohio roads like memory clings to moments never properly closed. Elon sat in the front passenger seat of Tanya's car, her playlist filling the quiet with soft acoustic songs, melancholy enough to match the mood, yet warm enough to make silence feel like a shared choice rather than an absence. They hadn't spoken much after leaving the hospital the night before. There wasn't a need. Some moments, Elon had come to learn, exist more truthfully in silence. "She used to say the best stories are the ones we never plan to tell," Tanya finally said, her eyes on the road ahead. "The ones that sneak up on us, that dig their way out whether we're ready or not." Elon nodded slowly, his fingers resting on the edge of a manila envelope he had brought from California. Inside were printed copies of every letter he'd written in the last week, unedited, raw, personal. He hadn't known what he was going to do with them. Now he did. When they arrived back at the community hall, now quiet, almost sacred after what had taken place there, it felt less like entering a venue and more like stepping into a time capsule. The light fell through the stained glass windows in new patterns that morning, as though the space was rearranging itself to receive something sacred. Tanya helped him set up a small table in the front. On it, he placed the envelope. Then, beside it, a journal. Then a plaque. The plaque was simple. "The Callahan Letters Project." Because the stories we never finish often become the ones we most need to tell. It was Tanya who spoke first at the soft reopening of the space. There were maybe 20 people present, students, teachers, local writers, even a curious librarian who had heard rumors about the letters. She stood in front of them all, holding Elon's journal. "This," she began, "isn't a tribute to a teacher. It's a living story, one that belongs to anyone who's ever written something they were afraid to share. One that started with a letter not sent and has now become a doorway." She gestured toward Elon, who stepped forward slowly. He didn't bring a speech, just a single printed letter. "Dear Ms. Callahan, you saw me before I even knew there was something worth seeing. You held my words in your hands when I had no voice for them. And now, it's our turn to do the same for someone else. If there's a student who feels like no one will ever care about what they wrote, let them know we kept every word. And we passed it on." The applause was soft, reverent. It wasn't about celebration. It was about recognition. After the gathering, several attendees lingered. One woman in her early 30s approached the journal, touching it like a sacred text. "My son is 13, she said to Elon. "He writes poems on sticky notes and hides them in his backpack. I want him to know there's a place for them." "There is now," Elon replied. Another man, older, white-haired, with a cane, stepped forward next. "I used to be a teacher too," he said. "Retired now. I've got old boxes in my attic full of essays and drawings from students I couldn't forget. Maybe I'll start writing them back." "Do it," Elon said. "Maybe that's what they've been waiting for all along." By late afternoon, the journal already held 4 new entries. Short letters, fragments of memory, bits of poetry. Tanya had made a small sign beside it. "You don't have to write something perfect, just something true." Elon found himself sitting by the window again, staring out at the street where life went on in ordinary ways, traffic lights changing, kids riding bikes, people walking dogs. But now, he saw the world a little differently. Not as a puzzle to solve, not as a system to redesign, but as a collection of stories waiting to be heard. Some spoken, some buried, all sacred. Tanya sat beside him. "She'll be happy," she said. "She already is," Elon replied. "She just wanted to know it wasn't for nothing." "It never was," Tanya said. There was a pause. Then she pulled a folded piece of paper from her coat pocket. "I've been holding on to this," she said, handing it to him. He unfolded it slowly. It was her original story from Ms. Callahan's class, handwritten in ink that had begun to fade, filled with crossings out and margins of commentary. But was brilliant, raw and painful and electric. A story about a girl who heard the world too loudly and built a soundproof room around her heart just to survive. Elon looked up at her. "Why didn't you ever share this?" "I didn't think it mattered." "It does," he said, eyes locked with hers. "It still does." She smiled. "Then maybe I'll finish it." "Maybe we all should," Elon said. As the last rays of the sun broke through the stained glass, illuminating the table where the letters rested, the quiet settled once more, not with finality, but with promise. Because something had begun here. Not a project, not a tribute, a conversation, one that was no longer afraid to be heard. The days that followed the official launch of the Callahan Letters project moved slowly, yet with a sense of quiet urgency. Elon returned to California, but left something behind in Ohio. No, not something. Himself. A version of himself he hadn't spoken to in decades. And as strange as it felt, it was a relief. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to race toward the next impossible thing. He was walking back, retracing emotional footprints. And every step he took in the present seemed to echo somewhere deep in the past. He had expected the project to stay small, maybe local, maybe something intimate and contained. But that wasn't what happened. Someone had taken a photo of the journal display beneath the stained glass windows, capturing a message written in messy handwriting. "I was 12 when someone told me my voice was too loud. Now I write poetry like thunder." They posted it online with the caption, "The stories we were afraid to finish might be the ones we need the most." By the end of the week, the post had been shared over 100,000 times. By the end of the month, Elon's foundation had received over 3,000 handwritten letters from students, adults, retirees, and educators from every state in the country, and a few from abroad. Some letters were simple. "I haven't written anything in years, but your project reminded me that I used to be brave." Others were full essays, stories, confessions, memories poured onto paper like rain from a long-held storm. Elon read every single one, or tried to. Late at night, in his office, with the lights dimmed low, he would open a new envelope and let the words find him. Most nights, he didn't make it through more than 5 or 6 before he felt the need to stop, breathe, and sit with what he had read. There was a heaviness to these letters, but not the kind that pulled him under. It was the kind that made him feel rooted, human, small but in the best way. He'd long been known for building large things. Now, he was beginning to see the power of small ones. One letter in particular stayed with him. It arrived in a yellow envelope from a woman named Carla R., a retired teacher from Nebraska. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded into thirds. "Dear Elon, I don't know you. Not really. I've read the headlines, the controversies, the accolades. But I don't care about any of that. I care that someone remembered what it felt like to be a student with something to say and nowhere to say it. I taught for 42 years. I saved every letter a student ever gave me. I thought I was the only one who did that. Thank you for reminding me that we aren't alone in the way we remember." Carla. Attached to her letter was a photocopy of a note from one of her students, dated 1987. It said, "Thanks for not laughing when I said I wanted to be a writer." Elon stared at that photocopy for nearly 15 minutes. Then he scanned it and added it to the archive. That was another thing that had evolved. What began as a symbolic journal was quickly transforming into a fully digitized archive, maintained by a team of librarians, educators, and writers funded through his foundation. Tanya had become the heart of it. She ran the project like a conductor, balancing outreach with authenticity, pushing back against attempts to commercialize or sanitize the emotional grit of what they were collecting. She insisted that they preserve the original voice of every contributor even the ones that rambled or misspelled or wrote in fragments. "These aren't essays," she told the media team one afternoon during a planning call. "They're echoes. You don't edit echoes. You honor them." Elon had watched her grow into that role with awe. She had a way of listening that made people speak differently, slower, more honestly. Sometimes he wondered if she'd always had that gift and just never been given the platform to use it. Other times he wondered how many other teachers like Ms. Callahan had passed through life without anyone ever realizing they'd been architects of quiet revolutions. One evening, Elon and Tanya sat together in the small side office of the foundation building, sipping tea and going through a new batch of letters. "I keep thinking about names," Tanya said after a long silence, "about how much weight they carry. We carry our own, but also the names of those who shaped us." "What do you mean?" Elon asked. "I mean, Callahan wasn't just a name. It was a presence, a memory, an anchor," she said. "I think every one of us carries a few of those. And maybe part of healing is learning how to say their names out loud again." Elon nodded. "We should add a section to the project," he said. "A space where people can just list the names of those who changed them. A digital wall of echoes." "I love that," Tanya replied. "Not even stories. Just names, like candles in the dark." They called it the Name Wall. Within a week of launching that feature, tens of thousands of names were submitted. Some with short notes, some with nothing at all. Just names. Teachers, coaches, librarians, janitors, aunts, foster parents, strangers, people who had, even briefly, reminded someone else that their story mattered. Ms. Callahan's name appeared 712 times. That night, Elon visited the hospital again. Ms. Callahan was weaker now, her voice thinner, but her eyes still sparkled like the sky just before sunrise. He showed her the numbers, the letters, the wall. She smiled. "You didn't build a company," she whispered. "You built a mirror. A mirror. One where people finally see themselves. And remember, they're not broken. Just unfinished." He swallowed the emotion rising in his throat. "Would you like me to read you something?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Read me one of the letters." He chose one at random, his voice steady but soft. "Dear whoever reads this, I never thought my scribbles mattered. I grew up in a house where silence was safer than speaking. But when I wrote my first story, I felt like I existed. Just for a moment. And now, you've given that moment a home. Thank you." When he looked up, Ms. Callahan was crying. Not loudly, just the way some tears fall when there are no more words left. He reached for her hand again, and in the quiet, they stayed there, 2 generations of storytellers, connected not by blood or fame or obligation, but by something much older, the act of remembering. It was the sound of her name echoing softly in the hospital hallway that brought Elon back to that fragile awareness that life, at its core, is a collection of fleeting, unspeakable moments. Ms. Callahan's breath had grown shallower over the past few days. Her voice had thinned to almost a whisper, but her presence remained dense, intact, as though the soul of 1,000 stories still hovered just beneath her skin, unwilling to leave until the last page had been turned. Elon visited every evening. He no longer needed reminders in his calendar. This was an obligation. It wasn't duty. It was return. The doctors had given no formal timeline, only phrases like day by day and comfortable as possible. Tanya had moved into a small guest suite nearby, and together, she and Elon created a rotating system of quiet vigil. They didn't talk much during the visits. Instead, they read old letters, new ones, messages from people across the globe who had heard about Ms. Callahan and wrote not just to thank her, but to confess. "I never had a teacher like you. I used to think my voice didn't matter. I lost my father when I was 12 and wrote poems in the dark. I stopped, but now I've started again." Elon began to curate these letters into something more tangible. With Tanya's help and a small team of editors, they began designing a book. The title had come to him in a dream, What We Leave Behind. It wouldn't just be a tribute. It would be a map, made of moments, names, and unfinished stories that spoke louder together than they ever had apart. One evening, as rain fell gently outside the hospital window, Elon sat beside Ms. Callahan, holding one of the mock-ups of the book's first chapter. Her fingers, still nimble despite their fragility, moved gently over the page like a blind woman reading Braille, memorizing the shape of meaning. "You gave us all something we didn't know we needed," Elon said. "You kept our words safe when we couldn't even trust them ourselves." She smiled faintly, her eyes half closed. "And now you're doing the same." He swallowed hard. "You know, I always thought the future would be made of machines, circuits, code. And now I think the future's made of memory, of the people who choose to carry each other forward." She didn't respond immediately, but her hand found his. "I never had children," she said, "but I had all of you." Tanya entered quietly a few minutes later, bringing tea that neither of them really intended to drink. Her presence was like punctuation, arriving at exactly the right moment to make everything make sense. She looked at Elon, then at Ms. Callahan, then at the stack of letters growing in the corner of the room. "She needs to see it," Tanya said. "The book, not the draft. The real thing." "We can't rush the process," Elon said, rubbing his temple. "It has to be right. I'm not saying publish it. I'm saying print one. Just one. For her." He nodded slowly. "I'll call the printer tonight." The next morning, Tanya drove to the local press herself. The man behind the counter, his hands stained with ink and years of handling fragile words, listened patiently as she explained the urgency. He didn't hesitate. "We'll bind it by noon," he said. "No charge." By 1 p.m., the first edition of What We Leave Behind, simple, bound in soft navy linen with gold foil lettering, rested in Ms. Callahan's lap. Her eyes were too tired to read every word, but she flipped through the pages slowly, her fingers brushing over the names, the stories, the echoes. A whisper left her lips. "This is more than I ever hoped for." Later that day, Elon stood by the window, watching the light bend across the glass. It struck him just how cyclical everything really was. How the very windows that watched her teach all those years ago now witnessed her legacy taking form. One by one, her former students were arriving, not in crowds, not in dramatics, but quietly, like pilgrims to a quiet shrine. Each one brought a story, a letter, a thank you. They read to her softly, held her hand, kissed her forehead. She didn't need to say much. They were saying it for her now. That night, as he sat beside her once more, Elon pulled out a sheet of paper. On it, he had written something that wasn't a letter. It wasn't a story. It was a promise. "When we go, we leave behind not our names, but the way we made people feel seen. You made us feel like we mattered, and we will carry that forward. Every word, every silence, every moment you waited for us to become who we already were." He didn't read it aloud. He simply folded it, placed it into an envelope, and slipped it under her pillow. The next morning, when he returned, she was still, peaceful, and gone. The nurse who met him at the door spoke with reverence, like someone delivering the end of a story you didn't want to finish. Tanya was already there, her eyes red, her expression resolute. They didn't cry, not right away. They sat. They held her hands. They let the silence hold them the way she had once held their stories. And then, finally, Tanya said, "She waited for us to finish writing." Elon nodded. "She waited for us to remember." The book, her book, was released 1 month later. It wasn't marketed as a bestseller. It wasn't sent to press tours or talk shows. It was placed in public libraries, school lounges, counseling offices, free to download, free to print, free to use. And in the back of every copy, printed in small but clear lettering, was a note, dedicated to every teacher who saved a voice by listening. The funeral was small. That was how she wanted it. No grand speeches, no flowers with names, just music, simple piano pieces that drifted through the room like the faintest memory of something once beautiful. Tanya had chosen the venue, A garden chapel nestled among tall pines and winding paths, a place where sunlight filtered through tree branches and silence didn't feel like absence, but presence. Ms. Callahan had always believed that nature was the only cathedral we ever needed. Elon stood quietly at the back as people arrived. He didn't speak. He didn't shake hands. He just observed. There was a particular reverence in watching how people gathered not for obligation, but out of something deeper, gratitude, maybe, or the need to stand in the shadow of someone who had once carried their story like it mattered. Each person who stepped forward to speak shared not memories of grand accomplishments, but tiny moments. A sentence that changed their life. A book she lent them. A conversation by the lockers that helped them survive just one more day. It was never about what she taught. It was how she listened. The invisible act of noticing. When Tanya finally stepped up to the podium, she didn't bring notes. She brought a journal. The same one from the community hall. She held it open with both hands gently. "I was going to write something," she began, her voice soft but steady, but I realized she already wrote it for me. "So instead, I'm going to read you what she once wrote in the margin of my essay when I was 16. She turned to a marked page. "You are not too much. The world just hasn't learned to hear you yet. Don't shrink. Speak louder." There was a long silence after that. The kind of silence that fills the room rather than empties it. And then Tanya closed the book and sat down, her hands folded, eyes brimming but calm. Elon didn't speak at the service. He wasn't ready. But afterward, as the guests mingled among the pines, he found himself walking alone through the garden paths, the gravel crunching softly beneath his shoes. He passed a stone bench, weathered by time, and sat. In his coat pocket, he carried an envelope. Not for anyone else. For her. He unfolded it slowly. "Dear Ms. Callahan, I spent most of my life running toward the stars because I thought maybe that's where the answers were. But now I think the real question was never what's out there. It was who am I here? And you, your words, your silence, your memory, helped me begin to answer that. You once kept my story safe when I didn't even believe it was worth finishing. Now I carry yours. I carry all of ours. This isn't the end. This is the start of something we'll keep writing. Every time a student picks up a pen, every time someone dares to speak even though they're scared, every time we remember the name of the person who first made us feel seen. Thank you for seeing me. Elon." He folded the letter again, pressed it between his palms, and sat there for a long while. He didn't cry, not because he wasn't moved, but because the grief didn't feel like loss. It felt like continuity, like something being handed from one soul to another. Back in California a week later, he stood in the middle of his foundation's office, now renamed the Callahan Center for Creative Memory, and addressed his staff. Not from behind a podium, just standing there among them. "I know some of you signed on to work in tech, in innovation, in outreach," he said, scanning their faces. "But what we're doing now is something else. We're not building rockets. We're building bridges. Between generations. Between the past and the possible. We're going to tell the stories that no one else wanted to carry. And we're going to make sure the names we remember don't get lost in the noise." They nodded. Some smiled. Others teared up quietly. The mission had changed, but the team had grown with it. That same month, the digital archive reached over 100,000 submitted letters. Libraries from 15 countries requested translated versions of the book. A major university launched a fellowship program in Ms. Callahan's name to support high school writing teachers in underserved communities. Tanya moved permanently to California. She became the project's director. Elon stepped back, not from a mission, but from the spotlight. He didn't need to be the face of the story. The story was bigger than him. It belonged to everyone who had ever written something in the dark, hoping it might be heard someday. One night, he hosted a private event. No cameras, no press. Just a fire pit, some folding chairs, and people from all ages and backgrounds reading their unsent letters out loud. One man in his 60s read a note he'd written to the father who never came home. A teenage girl stood trembling as she read a poem about her eating disorder. A woman whispered a story about the teacher who saved her life by noticing the bruise she didn't talk about. And after every letter, the group said the same phrase in unison. We hear you. We remember. It became a ritual, a healing, a thread binding voices that had long been lost to silence. Later that night, Elon looked up at the stars, not searching for answers anymore, but simply acknowledging them. He thought of Ms. Callahan, of the boy he once was, of the teacher who waited 25 years for him to finish a sentence he didn't know had power. And then he whispered the line aloud, just for himself. If I could just remind one person that they matter, then maybe I already have. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Elon first walked into the classroom that would become the physical heart of the Callahan Project. Not just an office or a library, not just a digital space, but a real classroom. In a refurbished wing of an aging school just outside San Francisco, where the project had quietly begun funding a new initiative called Voices Unwritten. The idea was simple. Every student, no matter their background, would get a chance to write their truth, and someone would always be there to read it. The space smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. Rows of desks lined the room, but none faced a chalkboard. Instead, they faced each other. A circle. No hierarchy, no front of the class. At the center, a wooden table where journals were stacked, some brand new, others already half filled with scribbled thoughts, pressed flowers, folded drawings, and pages where a sentence had been written, and then crossed out, rewritten, crossed out again. Elon didn't come here as a figurehead. He came as a student. Tanya greeted him by the door, smiling. You ready to meet the next generation of unsent letters? He smiled back. Only if they're ready to meet a man who still doesn't know how to finish his own. The classroom was buzzing with quiet energy. Kids between 12 and 17 from neighborhoods often left off innovation maps, each clutching a journal, a story, or nothing at all except a look of guarded curiosity. Tanya clapped her hands once. All right, writers, she said, her voice both teacherly and familiar. Today, we're doing something special. You've all written something you weren't sure you'd ever show anyone. And we have a guest who knows exactly how that feels. The room shifted as eyes turned to Elon. He stood, awkward but genuine, holding a worn notebook in his hand. I used to think the only way I'd matter was if I built something big, he said, voice steady. But lately I've realized sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is tell the truth. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. He opened the notebook. I want to read you something I wrote when I was 16. I never shared it until last year. It's messy, but it's mine. The room stilled. He read, I think sometimes the silence in our house is louder than yelling. I think my mom cries in the shower, so we won't hear. I think if I write it down, maybe it'll make sense. Maybe it won't, but I have to try. When he finished, the room was silent. Then slowly, a girl near the window raised her hand. Can I read mine? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tanya nodded. Always. And then, like a wave, the rest followed. One after another, students stood and read. Letters to fathers who disappeared, stories of brothers in jail, poems about bodies that didn't feel like their own, dreams of being somewhere, anywhere else. Each voice cracked open something. And each time, after every story, the class would respond with the phrase they had adopted from the Foundation's ritual. We hear you. We remember. By the end of the session, Elon felt something inside him shift again. Not because the students looked up to him, but because they didn't have to. They weren't waiting for him to teach them. They were inviting him to learn. After class, he sat with Tanya in the hallway, leaning against the lockers like a teenager after school, the sun stretching gold across the tiled floor. They're incredible, he said. They're honest, she replied. That's rarer than incredible. He looked down at the notebook in his lap. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Ms. Callahan hadn't saved our stories? Tanya thought for a moment. We would have kept walking through the world, pretending we didn't have anything to say. He nodded. And now, she said, we're making sure no one else has to carry that silence alone. They stayed there a while, not saying much, just listening to the sounds of kids gathering backpacks, sneakers squeaking on linoleum, laughter echoing off the walls. Elon checked his watch, but for once didn't rush. When he finally stood to leave, He handed Tanya a flash drive. "What's this?" she asked. "A new program," he said. "Letters Across Time." She raised an eyebrow. "It's a digital pen pal network," he explained. "We pair students with writers from other generations. They share letters, real letters, one a month, for a year. No likes, no views, just stories." Tanya smiled. "You've officially gone analog." "Only where it counts," he said. Before he left the school, he took one final walk through the hall. On the wall outside the classroom hung a simple frame with a quote. "A teacher's job isn't to tell you who you are. It's to hold space while you find the courage to tell yourself." MC. Elon paused, placed his hand gently on the glass, and exhaled. This classroom would outlive them. Not in years, in echoes. The days after the classroom launch unfolded with a strange blend of momentum and stillness. Tanya often described it as the quiet revolution, something that didn't erupt but rippled. The Callahan Center's pilot classroom had already inspired over 30 requests from other schools to replicate the model. But Elon didn't focus on scale, at least not now. Instead, he found himself coming back to the same space, the same circle of desks, like a lighthouse for his thoughts. One Friday afternoon, after the last student had left and the soft clatter of backpacks and sneakers faded into the distance, Elon remained in the circle. The journals were still there. Some students had left theirs behind deliberately, as if trusting the space to protect them. Others took theirs home, like sacred objects. Elon picked up one left behind, the cover worn, the edges of pages curled from frequent flipping. Inside, on the first page, a message was written in blue pen. "Dear future me, please remember how this felt." He closed it gently. Tanya entered a few minutes later, holding 2 cups of tea and a yellow folder. "You keep coming back here like it's a church," she said, handing him one of the cups. He took it with a grateful nod. "It kind of is." She sat down beside him in one of the student chairs, kicking off her shoes like it was her own living room. "We got a letter," she said, tapping the folder. "Another one." "Yeah, but this one's different. It's from a guy named Vincent M. from Detroit. He's a mechanic, never finished high school. But when he heard about the project, he started writing about his childhood, about the one teacher who ever believed in him. He asked if he could share his story even though he wasn't one of the smart ones." Elon raised an eyebrow. "What did you say?" Tanya smiled. "I told him this." She gestured to the classroom. The journals, the light streaming in through the windows, was built for him. She opened the folder and handed Elon the letter. It was handwritten, not neat, but powerful. Halfway through reading it, Elon looked up. "We should go to him." "What?" "We should visit. Not just Vincent, but people like him. All of them. The ones writing letters from across the country. They're already part of the story. Why not bring the classroom to them?" Tanya stared at him for a moment, then leaned back in her chair. "A traveling classroom?" "No," he said, shaking his head, thinking aloud. "A traveling listening space. No desks, no lessons, just an open circle, a box of journals, and an invitation. Write what you've never had the chance to say." Tanya set down her tea slowly. "And who reads it?" "We do," Elon replied. "And anyone willing to sit in the circle." They worked late into the night sketching ideas on the whiteboard, locations, themes, a loose framework for what would eventually become known as the Callahan Circles. By the following month, the first mobile unit had been designed, a repurposed Airstream trailer transformed into a roving sanctuary of paper, memory, and voice. Inside, the walls were lined with corkboard and soft light. Shelves held journals, blank and full. A small round rug sat in the center, surrounded by beanbags, not chairs. Above the doorway, engraved in wood, was the phrase, "Write it down. Someone will read it." The first stop was Detroit. Vincent welcomed them with grease-stained hands, a nervous smile, and a story that stunned everyone who listened. He wasn't just a mechanic. He had been a poet once. Before life, work, survival took over. His journal entry that night ended with a line that would eventually become one of the project's mantras. I thought silence meant safety. Now I know it only means staying lost. After Detroit, they went to New Mexico, then Chicago, then a tiny town in Maine where 5 people showed up and all 5 left crying. In every place, they heard echoes of their own pasts, fears, hopes, shame, and the stubborn resilience of people who had kept their stories locked away for too long. Elon, often so used to being the center of innovation headlines, now felt more like a carrier pigeon, transporting voices, collecting stories, bringing them back to the archive with reverence. And strangely, he felt more useful than he ever had. Late one night, in a motel outside Tulsa, Tanya sat on the floor surrounded by new letters. Elon handed her a folded piece of paper. It wasn't typed. It wasn't dated. It was a note. I used to think memory was something you left behind. Now, I think it's what we walk toward when we're ready to come home. She looked up at him. Did you write this? I don't know, he replied. Maybe the 16-year-old me did. She laughed softly and leaned her head against his shoulder. They didn't say anything more that night, but in the stillness, surrounded by stories that had once been too heavy to carry, something became clear to both of them. They weren't just collecting letters. They were rebuilding classrooms. Classrooms without walls. Classrooms made of ink and courage. By the time spring had folded into summer, the Callahan Circles had visited 17 cities across 11 states. What began as a tribute had become a movement. People weren't just writing again, they were remembering. And remembering, as Elon was learning, was not a passive act. It was an act of resistance. To forget was easy. To choose to carry memory forward was something else entirely. On a Tuesday morning in June, the mobile unit arrived in Asheville, North Carolina. The town was warm and green, tucked between blue ridges and the hush of slow living. Tanya had mapped out the location in advance, a quiet community park not far from a local school that had recently closed. The Airstream was parked beneath a willow tree, its silver body gleaming under soft clouds. Inside, volunteers arranged fresh journals on the shelves and lit a few low-scent candles. Elon stood outside, sipping coffee, watching the way people approached, slowly, curiously, almost reverently. A young woman in her 20s was the first to enter. She wore a thrifted denim jacket and carried a camera strapped across her chest. She didn't speak. She just nodded, walked inside, and sat cross-legged on the rug in the center. A volunteer handed her a blank journal. She took it, opened to the first page, and began to write without hesitation. Elon watched through the open door as her pen flew across the page, like it had been waiting years for this chance. He stepped inside quietly and sat across from her. She looked up briefly, her eyes red but clear. "Do you want to share it?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then nodded. "I've never said this out loud." "You don't have to." "I want to." Her voice broke only once as she read, a letter to her mother who had passed away during the pandemic. She had never had the funeral, never written the eulogy. The grief had settled into silence. Until now. When she finished, Elon said the phrase he had now said dozens of times but still felt new every time. "We hear you. We remember." Later that afternoon, a local 6th grade teacher brought her class. They didn't come to write. They came to listen. Elon invited them to form a circle outside under the willow tree. Tanya read them a story submitted anonymously the month before about a boy who had once hidden his drawings in library books because he was too afraid someone would laugh at them. At the end, a boy in the group quietly raised his hand. "I draw," he said. "Would you like to show us?" Tanya asked. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a worn sketchbook. Inside were intricate pencil drawings, worlds, characters, cities in the clouds. Elon leaned closer. "These are incredible." The boy shrugged. "I was gonna stop." "Why?" "No one ever looked before." Tanya placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We're looking now." The boy's name was Caleb, and he would later become the first feature artist in the Callahan Visual Archive, a space added to the Foundation's digital project dedicated to young creators who didn't use words but still told stories. That night, Elon lay awake in his hotel room, listening to the cicadas outside the window. Tanya sat in the armchair near the corner, flipping through a stack of handwritten letters collected from the day. "You know what I've realized?" she said, looking up. "What's that?" "This isn't just about what we're building. It's about what we're undoing. Shame, fear, isolation, all the stuff that kept these stories buried for years." He nodded slowly. "It's strange, isn't it? I spent so long thinking the most powerful thing we could do was invent the future. Now, I think maybe it's protecting the past, or at least making peace with it." She set the letters down and looked at him for a long moment. "Do you think she knew, Ms. Callahan, that this would happen?" "I think," Elon said, "she just hoped someone would carry it forward. She didn't need to know how far. She just needed to know it wouldn't be forgotten." They sat in silence after that, the kind that doesn't need to be filled, just witnessed. By the end of the summer, Elon and Tanya returned to Pine Hill. The town hadn't changed much. The diner still served burnt coffee and perfect pie. The school still creaked when you walked its hallways. But something was different now, not in the town, but in them. They stood together at the edge of the old football field, the bleachers rusted, the scoreboard frozen on a game no one remembered. Tanya took out her phone and pulled up a photo. "This just came in," she said, turning the screen toward him. It was a group of students in rural Oregon, sitting in a barn, each with a journal on their lap, writing under strings of bulb lights hung between rafters. Someone had captioned it, "Tonight we wrote under stars we couldn't see, but we knew they were there." Elon smiled. "They're everywhere now." "Yeah," Tanya said, "just like paper planes." He looked at her. "That's what this is," she continued. "Every letter, every circle. We fold these stories into paper planes and we launch them into the sky, not knowing where they'll land, just knowing they deserve to fly." He didn't say anything. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something he had been carrying since the beginning, the letter Ms. Callahan had written to him all those years ago. The same paper, the same ink, the one that had changed everything. He looked down at it, folded it carefully, then, with slow hands, turned it into a paper airplane. He handed it to Tanya. She raised her eyebrow. "You sure?" He nodded. "It was never just mine." She stepped back, held it gently, and launched it into the warm Pine Hill breeze. They watched it fly, wobbly at first, then steady, until it disappeared. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. By late August, Elon and Tanya returned to California, carrying something neither of them could name. It wasn't fatigue, though they were tired. It wasn't grief, though the weight of Callahan's absence still pressed against the moments between conversations. It was something closer to awe, a reverence for the quiet magnitude of what had unfolded, story after story, hand after hand, voice after voice breaking the seal of silence and finding a place to land. And now, the work was changing again. The road was no longer just an extension of Ms. Callahan's legacy. It was becoming its own living organism, something sacred, unpredictable, and fiercely alive. The Callahan Center had doubled in staff. New requests poured in daily from schools, community centers, prisons, recovery groups, even retirement homes. People who had lived lifetimes in silence were asking for journals, for a voice, for someone to listen. And so Elon proposed a new idea. Not a new app, not a new machine, but something radically analog. "What if we build a physical archive?" he said during a late meeting with Tanya and the lead coordinators. "Not just digital backups, not just servers, a real place, a sanctuary of letters." Tanya looked up from her notepad. "You mean like a museum?" "Not exactly," Elon replied. "Museums preserve. This would breathe. A place where people come not just to observe, but to write, to read, to remember." He paused, glancing out the window where dusk was softening the edges of the world. "Think of it like a living library. Every wall lined with drawers of real letters. Names only visible if the writer wants them to be. Stories open for the reading. Places to sit, to speak, to cry, to stay." Tanya tapped her pen against her journal. "Where?" "El Sereno," Elon said. That old Spanish mission they closed 2 years ago. It's perfect, quiet, open, and full of history. It took just 3 weeks to secure the site. 2 months later, the restoration began. They didn't modernize it. No touch screens, no neon. The space itself was the message. Adobe walls, natural light, wooden benches. At the center of the main room, a circular hearth, a place not for fire, but for voice. A place where, once a day, a selected letter would be read aloud to whoever was present. No introductions, no summaries, just words. The Callahan Sanctuary opened quietly in early November. No ribbon cutting, no press, just an open door, a bowl of pens, and shelves waiting to be filled. On the second day, an elderly man entered with a small cardboard box. He said nothing, just nodded to Tanya at the desk, placed the box on the counter, and walked back out. Inside were 27 letters, dated from 1963 to 1989, each addressed to his wife. She had died of cancer 30 years earlier. He had written to her every month since. Never mailed them, never showed anyone. He left a note on top. I think she'd be okay with sharing now. Tanya didn't cry when she read them. She waited until she got home. The letters were added to the eternal shelf, a corner of the sanctuary reserved for anonymous offerings. They weren't sorted. They weren't cataloged. They simply existed, for someone someday to find. Elon arrived later that week and walked the rooms in silence. There was something almost monastic about it, the way people moved through the space slowly, respectfully, their hands brushing the spines of shared memory. A woman sat by the window, reading a letter aloud to herself. 2 teenagers whispered as they folded their pages into paper airplanes and launched them from the courtyard into the trees. One young man wept openly beside a letter titled, "To my future son, if I ever have one." No one interrupted him. No one had to. That was the power of the place. It didn't ask for performance. It asked for presence. That evening, Elon sat with Tanya in the back garden, a quiet stone circle lit by candle jars. The letters they'd read that day sat on a bench between them, some recent, some decades old. Tanya handed Elon a folded piece of parchment. "This one's from Guatemala," she said. "It came yesterday." He opened it and read, "I don't have electricity every day, but I have a pencil. And when I write, I feel like I'm part of something bigger than the mountain I live on. I don't think you'll read this, but maybe someone will. And if they do, tell them I'm here." Elon folded the letter slowly, his eyes misting. "They're all here," he said softly. "All of them." Tanya nodded. "Even the ones who never write." He leaned back, staring up at the darkening sky. "I used to believe silence was just an absence of sound, but now I think it's the space where memory waits." Tanya turned toward him. "Do you know what Ms. Callahan used to say when someone was afraid to share?" He shook his head. She'd say, "You're not too late. You're just in time for someone else's healing." Elon smiled. "She was always 5 steps ahead of us." They sat there until the candles burned low, and when the last light flickered out, neither of them felt lost in the dark. They had found a new kind of map. It was just past the first rain of the season when Elon returned to the Callahan Sanctuary one quiet Thursday morning. The adobe walls glistened faintly, still damp from a night before, and the sky held that gentle post-rain clarity that made everything feel newly discovered. The sanctuary grounds smelled of wet earth, eucalyptus, and paper, the subtle aroma of worn pages and ink-stained memory. For Elon, it was no longer just a place of tribute. It had become something closer to sacred ground. Each time he stepped through its arched doorway, he could feel the presence of voices not gone, but waiting. There was a stillness to the sanctuary that morning, but not an emptiness, a kind of listening silence. He walked the corridors slowly, brushing his fingers along the shelves of hand-bound journals, each with its own spine, texture, and whispered story. Every drawer labeled not by genre, but by feeling, grief, forgiveness, longing, second chances. That had been Tanya's idea, to let emotion guide the architecture of a place, not logic. "We're not archiving facts," she had said once. "We're archiving hearts." As Elon approached the center room, the round chamber with the daily reading circle, he noticed a new addition. A wall covered with pinned postcards, each with the same printed phrase at the top. "I never said this out loud, but..." Visitors were encouraged to finish the sentence. Some were typed, some handwritten, some barely legible, but every one of them, in its own way, was an offering. "I still talk to you even though you're gone. I'm scared I peaked at 17. I forgave you even though you never asked me to. I think I was meant to be someone else." He stood there for several minutes, reading line after line, until the air around him felt thick with the weight of human truth. Not performative, not poetic, just honest, raw. Behind him, Tanya appeared carrying 2 mugs of cinnamon tea. "Back for more?" she asked, handing him one. "Always," he replied. They sat in the alcove beneath the archway, a quiet corner filled with donated cushions and secondhand blankets. Tanya pulled out her tablet and opened a document. "Letters from this week," she said, scrolling. "Want to hear a few?" Elon nodded. She began reading. "Dear stranger who reads this, I don't know how to talk to my dad, so I'm practicing here. He's alive, but we don't speak. I'm scared he'll die before I find the right words. I guess what I'm trying to say is thank you for listening, even if you're not him." She paused. "Should I go on?" He nodded again. "Dear Ms. Alvarez, you probably don't remember me, but you once stopped me in the hallway and said I looked tired. I hadn't slept in 3 days. That moment saved me. You didn't know it, but you saved me. I've waited 20 years to say that." Tanya closed the tablet. "There are hundreds more." Elon exhaled, leaning back against the adobe wall. "I used to think legacy was what people said about you after you died. Now, I think it's what people whisper when you're not in the room." Tanya smiled. "Or what they write when no one's watching." Later that day, a group of high school seniors arrived from a school 2 towns over. They had come not for a project, but because their English teacher, Ms. Kerr, had given them a challenge: write a letter to someone who shaped you and then read it in a place that understands what letters mean. The students gathered in the reading room, some fidgeting nervously, others clutching papers tightly, as if the act of holding the page gave their voice strength. Elon and Tanya joined the circle as silent listeners. The first to read was a boy named Leo, tall, lanky, with sleeves that swallowed his hands. He cleared his throat and began. "Dear Mom, I know I never said it, but I watched you every day. I saw how hard it was, and I'm sorry for every time I made it harder. You always said I'd understand when I was older. I think I do now. I miss you more than I say." This is me saying it. There were no claps, no forced praise, just the steady rhythm of collective breath. One by one, they read letters to teachers, to siblings, to versions of themselves that no longer existed. And when it was over, Elon stood, not to speak, but to kneel beside the center table where the daily letter was selected. He reached into the box and pulled one at random. It read, "To the one who gave up too early, you still matter. Come back, even if it's just on paper." He read it aloud, slowly, letting every syllable settle. Then he added his own voice to the ritual phrase, "We hear you. We remember." That night, after the sanctuary had closed and the doors were locked, Elon and Tanya walked through the candlelit halls with no destination in mind. He stopped beside a shelf marked Restarts, pulled out a journal labeled Only AK, and read the first page. "I am writing this because I want to be someone I can recognize again." Tanya appeared beside him. "That's my favorite section." "Why?" "Because every story in there begins with someone coming back to themselves." He closed the journal, nodding. "We should add another shelf." "What theme?" He thought about it for a long moment, then said softly, "Hope, when you're not sure it's allowed." Tanya smiled. "I'll make the label." Before leaving, Elon stopped at the back corner of the sanctuary, a quiet alcove where Ms. Callahan's original letter to him was framed. Not with fanfare, not in gold, just placed behind glass beside a worn desk and an old, empty notebook. Beneath the frame, a plaque read, Some stories begin before we're ready to write them, but they wait. And when we return, they become the chapters that save someone else. He stood there alone for a while, and then he whispered, "I'm still writing." A month after his last visit to the sanctuary, Elon found himself sitting alone in his Palo Alto study, surrounded not by innovation or architecture, but by letters. Stacks of them. Thousands now bundled in string, cataloged by hand, and sent from every state, every age, every kind of human moment. The room smelled like paper and dust and hope, like the remnants of stories too long held inside. On the far wall, he'd framed a new quote, one he had scribbled on a post-it during one of the mobile stops when a woman had asked him, "What do we do with the stories we're still afraid to write?" His answer had come without thinking. "You write them anyway, and let someone else be brave with you." Now it lived on his wall. In the corner of the room sat a box labeled, "Letters I'm Not Ready to Read." He knew what was inside. Pages people had handed him directly, with shaking hands and eyes that said, "This is everything." He hadn't read them yet, not because he didn't want to, but because some stories he'd learned need time to arrive fully. Just like people, he picked up a pen, turned to a clean sheet of paper, and began writing, not as a CEO or a figurehead or even a former student, just as Elon, just a man who once received a letter from a teacher who remembered him better than he remembered himself. Dear reader, this is not a conclusion. This is a doorway. You've walked through the lives of people brave enough to speak. You've watched what happens when silence is met with softness instead of shame. Maybe you saw yourself in one of these pages. Maybe you saw someone you miss, or someone you could still become. This story isn't about me, or Ms. Callahan, or any single letter. It's about what happens when we let truth breathe, when we choose to carry each other's words instead of judging them, when we admit that we're all still learning how to say what we really feel. So here's my ask, write one more letter. Write it to the person you were, or the one you're becoming. Write it to your mother, your student, your stranger. Leave it unsent if you have to, but don't leave it unwritten, because someone somewhere is waiting to remember what it feels like to be heard. And maybe that someone is you. With gratitude, Elon. He folded the page and slid it into an envelope. On the front, he wrote only one word, "Continue." 2 weeks later, Tanya stood in front of a crowded auditorium in Austin, Texas. It was the first public storytelling event hosted by the Callahan Project. No camera crews, no press, just people, teachers, students, parents, survivors. They filled the seats, holding copies of What We Leave Behind in their laps, many dog-eared and highlighted. On the stage was a single wooden podium and an empty chair. Tanya looked out at them, then opened her journal. "We don't come together because we all have the same story," she began. "We come together because we've all been waiting for a place to tell it." Then she stepped aside and invited the first speaker to the stage. A man in his 70s, former prison librarian. His letter was to the inmates he never got to say goodbye to before retirement. Then a young girl, 12, wearing oversized headphones, who wrote a letter to the future version of herself who was no longer afraid to raise her hand. Then a mother, then a foster son, then a man who hadn't spoken to his father in 30 years. After 2 hours, the microphone didn't get quieter. It grew louder, braver, and at the end, when Tanya returned to the stage, she asked only one thing. If you've heard something tonight that reminded you of someone, write to them. Don't wait for perfect. Write what's true. The next day, over 1,200 letters were dropped in the sanctuary's traveling mailbox. Elon didn't attend that event. He was already en route to the next city. But that evening, in a small hotel room in Salt Lake City, he watched the live stream from his laptop. When the final speaker finished and the crowd stood in silence, he stood too. He didn't know why. He just did. The Callahan Project never became a headline-grabbing movement. It didn't trend. It didn't crash stock markets or make waves in boardrooms. But it built something else. It built trust. It built circles. It built shelves in places where shame used to live. And years later, in schools and parks and libraries, people still gather around the simple act of reading aloud a letter that once had nowhere to go. In some cities, teachers start their semesters with journals labeled, "Before I tell you my name." In others, children are encouraged to write letters to their future selves and seal them in community time capsules. In New Orleans, a church turned its confessional into a listening booth where people leave letters instead of sins. And in the sanctuary, every week, someone new walks in for the first time, not knowing what they need to say until the page invites it out of them. Back in Pine Hill, a memorial bench was placed beneath the tree where Tanya launched the paper airplane. On the bronze plaque, it reads, "For the teachers who listened, for the students who returned, for the letters still being written." Every few months, Elon visits, not to lead, not to speak, just to sit. One day, a boy about 10 years old sat beside him. "You the guy who started this place?" he asked. Elon smiled. "Not exactly. Just someone who got lucky with a good teacher." The boy nodded. "I wrote a letter." "Oh yeah? What did it say?" The boy hesitated. "It said I don't want to disappear." Elon looked at him. "Then you won't," he said. And they sat there in the soft sun, the wind moving through the trees, as if carrying every word that had ever been written there to someone who still needed it. So now we ask you, watching from your corner of the world, what would your letter say? Who is waiting to hear it? And more importantly, are you ready to write it? Let us know where you're watching from. Share a word, a memory, or just the first sentence of the letter you've been meaning to write. Because the end of this story isn't really the end. It's just your turn.